Right, welcome back. And following on from our last question about Petra, I have another question from somebody else in one of my groups, and this is it verbatim. So the question is, can you ask Jay to speak more about the Nabatean/Syriac connection? And again, I've not much of a clue what that means. So over to you.
Explain that. That's a very good question, and it does follow exactly. It's a good segue right into the next idea. If you have all these mosques facing Petra that are so accurate, we need to ask why Petra and why so accurate. And we did, of course, the answer is very clearly that this is the seat of the Nabatean Empire. Remember, the Nabataeans really didn't have an empire as we know today. They didn't have borders. They didn't have a capital. They didn't have armies. Who were they? They were traders. The Nabataeans were traders. They were at the forefront of trade from the 2nd century BC all the way up to the 7th century AD. They were the only ones able to cross the deserts. They were the only ones to go from oasis to oasis to oasis. And because of that ability, they were the only ones that could go all the way to China. They were the only ones that could get to India. They were the only ones that could get far to the Far East. And because they could get to the Far East, they were unique. And that's why they controlled the trade. And that's why they didn't need a kingdom. They were merchants who went on camelback. Now, because of the fact they had to go across deserts shift. Winds come, sand dunes change. There's no trees. There's no mountains that stay put that you can follow. When you go these vast hills of sand, there's roads there. So what do? How do you find your way? The Nabataeans had learned from a very early age to follow the stars. And they use a simple measurement with one block called the Kamal, Kamal, and a string. And they would always, whenever they wanted to go north or south, they would look to where the North Star was. The North Star always remained constant. It's a very bright star. It's not the brightest, but it's a very bright star in the sky, and it always stays constant. So they would always look and know that it's on the north. So they would look and they would put they would pull their block away from them until the North Star was on the top and the horizon was on the bottom. And they would take the string and they keep it on their teeth by depending on how far that string went. It had knots along it, and depending on where they stopped, and they could count how many knots were. They knew exactly how many paces they were to go in that direction. Now, hold on. Remember, you have to go exactly accurate. Why? If you miss it by a few hundred yards, you miss the well, you miss the oasis, you miss where the water was. These were their water wells. There's nothing there to show for it. And if you missed it by even a few hundred paces, you would die. Therefore, it was
just 1 degree at the center of a circle, 1 degree out. By the time you get to the radius, the circumference of the circle, you're completely out.
Absolutely.
So it could be life and death, yeah.
Well, they also had to know east and west. So how did they do east and west? Well, they have 32 stars on a round circle. And those 32 stars, they knew exactly where they were in that circle. And they knew that if they were to go they knew from people who had gone in the past, they knew that they had to go so many hundreds of thousands of paces in this direction towards that star. Now, after you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you start running out of it. After a while, if you get to 1,000, you can easily get off by 1 or 2 paces, right?
Yeah.
You get off by 1 numbers. You try counting for hundreds of thousands of numbers and see if you are consistent all the way as you want to and keep in step.
I let my phone do it, to be honest.
They didn't have phones back then. So what did they do? How did they do that? They used poetry. And they sang poetry. That's why the Arabs are so well known for their singing cadences. That's why you have these poems that go on for almost half an hour, because those poems are what the camel herders used, and they would know that they were to go in this direction towards that star, this poetry, this song with this poetry in it. They had to do that 5 times because that one piece of poetry may be 25,000 steps. So they would sing as they walked with the camels, and they would then know exactly that. And that after they got past these 5 cadences of that particular poetry, they then knew they had to go to this star and go 125,000 steps. So they would do another piece of poetry and go in that direction. And that's how they got to these oases absolutely perfectly. From knowing that, can you then understand why they knew how to use the stars better than anybody else?
Yes.
That's why they were the only ones able to cross the deserts where no one else could. Now, By the time the 9th and 10th century came into play, or the late 8th century, mid 8th century, up into the 9th and 10th, 11th, roads were then put in, because now the Muslims now controlled. They didn't need camel herders anymore. They now were in cities. They were now urbanized. They had all these cities, Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, that they had conquered in the mid 7th century. So now when they conquered these cities, they used roads from these two cities that went around the deserts. Therefore, they lost this ability to follow the stars.
Right, and that's why it changed their accuracy.
In the 9th century, these scholars were looking at these qiblas from these old ancient mosques. They were 100 to 200 years older, and they found that they were not facing Mecca. So they said, well, we must come to some conclusion. But they didn't know why that these mosques were not facing Mecca. They didn't bother to look and see that they're all facing Petra. They didn't bother to look and see how accurately they're facing Petra. They just assumed these guys didn't know much, because today we have mathematics.
Yeah.
In the 9th and 10th century, they used mathematics. So they tried to use all these mathematical equations to come up with their qiblas, which were okay, but they weren't as accurate as those stars. And that's why the Meccan mosques are more inaccurate than the Petran mosques, because that art had been lost. Now, here comes David King, who spent his whole lifetime reading only these 9th, 10th, and 11th century scholars and just taking what they thought. He said, oh, they must know because they're closer to the event and they're Muslims. Therefore, who am I, as a British man, how can I know better than the Muslims? So therefore, he took their word, assumed that they were correct. And of course, they were trying to justify all these misdirected qiblas. And they were saying it was because of the equinox. They were following the solstice lines. They're following the equinox lines. In this case, they were following Roman ruins. In this case, they were, with all the mosques that were facing straight south in northern Africa and also in Spain, those were going face straight south because they were following Roman roads. They were following churches that they had taken over, destroyed, and built over top of the church. The problem is they were all following the same direction.
Yeah.
They didn't take that into consideration. And what's more, if they didn't know where Mecca was, then how could they make the pilgrimage to Mecca?
Exactly.
They're all making the pilgrimage to Mecca. If they knew how to get there, then how could they build their mosque in that direction? Yeah. Ooh, I love this. And this is why, folks, don't use 9th, 10th, and 11th century hint or hunches, because these are all hunches. These are nothing more than theory. Why don't you go back to the 7th and 8th century and actually look and see how accurate they were, and then ask, how did they get their directions? How did the Nabataeans, who, remember, the Nabataeans, Petra was not their capital, it was their city, it was their sanctuary city. This is a city of tombs and temples. These are the people that built those beautiful rock carvings. Take a look at Petra. It is famous for its rock carvings. They were way ahead of the rest of the world. And they always sent their bodies, whenever they died, when they died in China, or when they died in India, or way up in Turkey, they always sent their bodies back to be buried in their family grave there in Petra. Right. So they always knew where Petra was. And they always used the stars to find out where Petra was. And that's why they were so accurate. And that's why if you want to find out about how Islam began, you need to go back to the Nabataeans. And another reason you need to go back to the Nabataeans is take a look at Petra. And you will find in Petra everything you'll find in Mecca. You will find that Petra has the Marwa and the Safa, the two different hills that you run back and forth from. These were actual hills. They're there today. If you go to Mecca, they're just pieces of rock. Mm-hmm. They've had to put facsimiles of them. So Mecca is the wrong place. It's a second Hajj. It's a second holy city. Petra also has the Kaaba, and the Kaaba that's in Petra fits exactly with the dimensions that we get from the traditions on the original Kaaba. And I could go on and on. Look at the Jamarat where they throw these stones in Mecca. They have 3 of them in Mecca. What do they have 3 for? There's only one devil that's referred to that you throw stones on, and that is now been found in Petra. So everything, you remember the Zamzam well?
Do you mean to say they've made a trinity of stones to be demonized?
It's not a trinity as we know. It's just 3.
They've made 3 of them when, in essence, they just need one. Where
did the 3 come from?
I don't know. I'm sorry. I thought you said there were multiple. So they had a replica of the hills. Yeah.
These are the 3 goddesses.
Alat, Aluza, and Manat.
This is a summation. We don't know. Don't quote me on that one. That one, don't quote me on, because there's an awful lot of research to be done. What we can say now is it looks like almost everything that Islam now used to already be in the 7th century in Petra, has now been transferred and transposed into Mecca. And the reason for that has to do with the Black Stone. Now, I'm not going to get into the Black Stone now. That's a whole nother talk for another time. But anyways, to answer your question, the reason they knew the Nabataeans are so important is because they are the one that gives us Arabic. The Arabic comes from the Nabataean. The name Allah is a Nabataean god. Ilaha is the god of the Nabataeans, but he is not their formal god. He is nothing more than generic name for their god. So they got the wrong god, the wrong name, the wrong place, and basically the wrong history. Mecca is not the original sanctuary. It was always Petra.
Brilliant answer. I think the person who asked that is going to be absolutely thrilled. I suppose the moral of the story is, if you find an error, go back to the people who had the right answer in the first place and try to kind of reverse engineer rather than going to the error itself and then, cross-referencing from there. So thanks everyone.
What we always do? Isn't that what we always do? Whenever you want to find a historical fact, go back historically and go to the earliest text. Go to the earliest event. Go to the earliest place, because those are the ones who will have
scripture, that kind of a theory. Go back to the original correct text and try and work out what went wrong, I guess. Yeah. Thanks ever so much, Jay, and we'll be back soon with another question. Thank you very much.